All right. Hey, everybody. Ready for another week of talking about research methods. So today we're going to be talking about research design. Um, and I don't know if I have too much material for you or too little material for you. So we'll see that as we go. Eh? So I actually put some thought into my random clip arts for the week because I love me some random clip arts. And when I was trying to think of symbols that could represent research design that might be available in the ready to use clip art section of Keynote, these are the three I came up with. We have a little piece of construction equipment because research design is about how you build the thing. We have a puzzle piece because research design is about how you make the puzzle fit together. And we have a map because research design is about how you make a plan. And so with those heavy-handed metaphors, let's dive in. There's this great line in McGregor's piece that I thought really kind of crystallized what we mean when we talk about research design, which is to say that you need logic and logistics. Both of those together make up the research design. And a lot of people think that it's just logistics, but the logistics, if they aren't founded in a sensible logic that explains why those logistics are the right logistics, they're meaningless. Okay? So you have to know what you're trying to show, test, prove, what kinds of data will help you answer that question, how it'll get connected to something else, right? You have to have this logical way of planning things out. And then you have to say, okay, now I need to actually gather information about the world in order to go out and do this. So like, what's that information going to be? How am I going to get it? What are the ways in which I would go on to analyze it? And pretty much without that, you're not going to have a well-structured project. Now, it's worth saying that different paradigms and different question types will end up putting you in different kind of zones for this, right? So when you see that McGregor was talking about how quantitative researchers need to know exactly what they're going to be doing and then follow that plan exactly, that's because of the type of question they're answering using quantitative methods. However, you still need a plan, even if you don't need to have everything laid out in advance. It's just that your plan looks different and your plan frequently changes, right? Now, I think, granted, I've never done a large scale quantitative project, but I'm pretty sure that quantitative researchers' plans change too, right? It's just that the way they change their plans is different. All of which is to say, this is big and messy and really interesting, right? So this kind of takes us through those logics of inquiry that we talked about before. Let's say you're in a situation where you have something you want to understand, something that exists in the world. You want to give the best explanation of it you can, and your focus is on that situation. You obviously care about the rest of the world, right? But you really want to explain that situation. So this is abductive logic. It's commonly used in interpretivist and some realist research, right? It's kind of in that zone. Alternately, you might have a set of situations you want to understand to see how they might contribute to a general point about something, right? You want to get to the point where you can propose a general idea of what might be going on in situations like these. And this is inductive, right? You're generating theory. Realists do inductive work, and so do positivists, right? And then the last kind of category here is deductive, right? Which is where you have a hunch or a theory or a hypothesis about what might be going on in a set of situations. Maybe this comes from your own understanding, which is in fact theoretical, right? Like, oh, I know why that might be. It's because of blah, right? And then you combine that with the existing research on the topic, and then you want to figure out if your hunch is right by figuring out if you can test it, right? This is deductive. Positivists do this. There are probably situations where realists do it as well. It's less likely to be something that interpretivists do, but it's really the core of positivism is about the relationship between induction and deduction, right? And quantitative positivist research is almost only deductive. The kind of positivist research that is inductive, that's quantitative, is really about fishing expeditions and it wasn't until the rise of big data that we really saw people being able to just kind of throw everything at a wall in a quantitative situation and see what stuck, right? And I think there's still a reluctance around that, right? So kind of a very common relationship between quantitative and qualitative data for positivists is that qualitative data lets you construct theory and quantitative data allows you to test theory. And then once a theory is in the process of being tested, you can kind of keep going back and forth with that. Obviously, that's not how interpretivists see it, right? It's a different way to go about it. And all of these kind of rest on the notion of having a case, right? So what is a case? The answer is a case can be about 12, but not 12, but it can be a lot of different things, right? So sometimes when you say a case, you mean the empirical thing you're talking about. My case is World War II, right? My case is, the three cases I'm looking at are Lebanon in the 80s, I don't know, 2 other civil wars, right? Sri Lanka in the 90s, and former Yugoslavia in the 90s, right? I don't know. I don't know what kind of project that would be, but I'm making one up, right? So that you can mean cases like that. You can also mean a case as an individual observation, right? So if you hear N used to count the number of cases in a project, right? You're like, N equals 750, right? In that case, they mean there are 750 observations that they analyzed, right? So when you get this distinction that some people make, which is a meaningful distinction, right, between big N and small n research, right? Large N research involves having a lot of observations, right? In some cases, those observations are countries. Remember, I've given you the quote from a text saying, here's why we could only look at 80% of the countries in the world, the other 20% we didn't have data for, right? So their data set was as big as the number of countries they could get observations for. That was their N, right? In other cases, observations are like in a survey, right? So each person who fills out your survey is one of your N, right? Whereas, researchers like me don't talk about our cases in terms of N, right? Or we say my case is N equals 1 because I was only studying one time and place, right? So even though I talked a little bit in class about my project that became my book, right? I studied one social service agency. I interviewed people at 3 different churches. 3 churches? Yeah, 3 churches. I participated in 2 different organizations, protest activities. I collected video about another 3 organizations, right? But my N is 1. My N is the Arab community of New York City, right? And that's because of how I construct an N, right? So the way you pick cases, right, is sometimes you try to figure out how many cases will help you make your point, right? Sometimes that's about balancing similarities and differences, right? So for instance, if you're comparing things to each other, you need some things that are similar and some things that are different, right? I chose to study 2 different social movement organizations because I was able to compare them to each other and also get a sense of what they had in common, right? If you're doing quantitative work, you need to think about random sampling versus purposive sampling, right? Random sampling is you try to get a random subset of what exists in the world, and that means it probably represents the population it comes from. Purposive sampling is usually used when you're doing a small set of studies because you have to actually pick with care what you're constructing. The other thing is how important the actual thing is, right? Let's think back to Shapiro's "Don't research boring crap." You pick a case based on the fact that it's interesting and that you think it has implications. So I realize this can all be a bit vague. I've got an example for you guys. So we're going to work through an article of mine because I have it handy in my head. You're going to see a lot of examples from my research in the coming weeks because it's the stuff I have to hand. So there's the citation for the article. It's in the Journal of Muslim Minority Affairs. I co-wrote it with a graduate student. So here's what happened. Long about February 2020, February 2012 it would have been. I was hanging out on Twitter like you do, and there was this hashtag, Muslim Candy Heart Rejects, right? And I saw a lot of these tweets being bounced back and forth between people I follow on Twitter. My Twitter feed contains a lot of Arab and Muslim American activists, writers, pundits, right? And this hashtag started bouncing back and forth between people. So like I added it to a tab on Hootsuite and I was laughing at it, right? And I kind of represent my thought process here, where at first I'm like, oh, haha, this is funny. And then I'm like, okay, a lot of people are doing this. And it's like, seems like people are making a lot of jokes about the war on terror in the process of making these like funny tweets about romance, right? Oh, it seems like people are making jokes about misogyny in Muslim organizations. That's really interesting. Oh, wow, people are making like dirty jokes, but you have to actually know a lot to get that dirty joke, right? And then I kind of had the vague thought, I wonder what this sort of thing means for online Muslim communities. What does the humor mean? What does the use of, how do hashtags work to do this function, right? I just kind of had a vague, this is interesting to me. So what did I do? I emailed myself a whole bunch of the tweets. I put them in a folder in my Gmail and I left them there, right? And just for the record, I have literally thousands of pieces of evidence stored in my Gmail that I will never get to analyze, right? But then I get a job at U Ottawa. I come to U Ottawa. I have a research assistant. I hire a research assistant. And I'm like, okay, perfect. This Muslim Candy Heart Rejects paper is the first thing I want to write. And so I sit down with Andre and I'm kind of working things through in my head to figure out how we get to something real. And I realized that the big question, I thought this was actually worth investigating in this data, right? Part of what I wanted to do was be like, ha ha ha, this is funny, right? But you don't write an academic paper on ha ha ha, this is funny, right? So I realized that my big question was actually about online communities. How do online communities mark out and create identity? How does identity exist in practice? What makes a Muslim Twitter thread Muslim, right? Like I was saying, like, this is a joke that happened among Muslims on Twitter. What makes a Twitter hashtag Muslim, right? Like this is a question that to me requires investigation. And so clearly I'm proceeding abductively. I'm not interested in a generalized theory at this point in time of online communities and identity, right? What I was interested in is understanding this case. And I thought if we can understand this case, then we can provide ourselves with kind of some terms and some concepts and some ideas to help understand how online communities do identity, right? And this was the point when I was thinking much more of my research would end up being in this online community space, which is still work I want to do, but it's become deprioritized because of other things. So like, you're not going to see the book from me on fandom and politics for like another decade because I have other things to be writing about right now, not like how Sherlock fanfic has to deal with the war on terror, which is totally a paper I have buried somewhere in notes, but that's not happening anytime soon. Okay, so this is kind of how I got to this point where I had the logic of the question down and I had the logic of what I was going to do, kind of how I'd start thinking about it. So the next thing I had to think about was data, right? Data and data analysis. And so data here means information collected and analyzed in an organized way. Any kind of information can be data, but it's not data until you collect it or organize it, right? So I had emailed myself a whole bunch of tweets. I, in fact, had not actually done data collection. What I'd done is kind of preserve some data. I then actually found a better way to get the data and get more complete data later, right? But that's it. I was just kind of like, I'm going to archive this and I'll come back to it later, right? What you have to do is identify it, how you're going to get it, what you'll collect, how you're going to analyze it, collect it, and then make it analyzable, and then analyze it, right? This is this whole process wherein you take things that exist in the world and turn it to information about things that exist in the world, and then turn it into something you can analyze. If this sounds a little technical, I kind of want to draw your eye to the interpretivist challenge to the notion of data. And there are some interpretivists who will never refer to what they collect as data, all right? I'm comfortable with the word data because I reject the kind of desire. I am not interested in letting positivists steal the word data from me. Let's put it that way. Other people are not interested in having the word data applied to them because they feel it's positivists colonizing their own work. You can see how these are different impulses, right? But The interpretivist critique is that the assumptions behind the use of data imply distinct and separate objects. Data is a plural, the individual is datum. Each individual datum should be able to be recorded in isolation to itself, and collectively they make up a whole, right? The word data is also used to kind of create a binary between objective data and impressions, which are subjective. And again, remember, interpretivists reject this binary between the objective and the subjective, right? They're like, no, everything is subjectivity, right? So you may not find an interpretivist calling what they collect data, or you might, right? You can see how there are different positions interpretivists would take on this question. And the big divide that we come down to is the distinction between qualitative and quantitative data. And I want to say, I have actually seen some really interesting kind of things being circulated recently where people are challenging this division, because quantitative data all has to start out as qualitative data because we're talking about qualities of the world and we're transforming it into numbers for a certain type of analysis. Or, qualitative data is not actually a common set of practices. It's it's too diverse to be considered one thing, right? I actually agree with a lot of these critiques, right? And again, kind of coming from this interpretivist tradition, I am all about blowing up these kinds of distinctions conceptually, but I want to give you guys the kind of mainstream approach to it. And then if you want to tool around with it in discussion section, we can totally do that, right? So the idea is that qualitative data is words or something you treat like words, right? Whereas quantitative data is numbers or something you convert into numbers, right? So you can convert the kind of affective quality of something into a number, right? And you'll see an example of that in the quant data I'm about to show you, right? Or you can leave it as words, right? Some things kind of are naturally numbers, right? GDP, age, income, number of people who voted, things like that. Some things come as numbers. It's not to say you can't then interpret them primarily as qualities, but sometimes they the numbers arise. Sometimes you have to create the numbers, right? And we'll show some examples of that. You can use both approaches to study the same real world phenomenon or on the exact same set of data sometimes. About to show you an example of that. Or you pick one. It depends what you want to do, right? 2 words to know here: mixed method and multi-method research. Mixed methods research is research that includes both qualitative and quantitative data, right? You take qualitative data and quantitative data and you do them at the same time, right? Maybe it's the same data both ways. Maybe it's one quant data set and one qual data set, right? But you put them together because you recognize there are different kind of benefits to each of them. Multi-method research is any research which involves multiple types of research. They can both be quant, they can both be qual. So, right, I think this distinction is a bit of a distinction without substance, but the people who do mixed methods research feel very strongly about it, and so I'm going to respect their right to define their terrain. I put a little note in there because I was coming up with a major wall I was hitting with McGregor, which is to say that she was saying quant and qual approaches the way I say positivist and non-positivist approaches, without any kind of critique of her analysis. I want to say that in political science, there's a substantial subset of people who do qualitative positivist work, right? A lot of mainstream qualitative work is positivist in its fundamental assumptions, right? Do not assume that qualitative work is non-positivist. You can assume, barring blaring red flags to the opposite, that quantitative work is positivist, right? But you can't assume that all qualitative work is non-positivist. So coming back to the story of my article, right? I had this logic, I had to use a method now, right? I knew I had all this data, right? How could I analyze it? So what I chose to do is discourse analysis, which is something we'll talk about later in the semester. And then I decided to use a mixed method approach because I knew there was information I could get out of the data in a quantitative way that I wanted to put in the service of this very qualitative approach, right? I needed to know something about numbers related to these tweets, kind of information that came as numerical data, right? And I also wanted to do some of the more like like kind of strict things you can do with quantitative data, right? I wanted to look for measures of association. And I said, okay, I'm going to test some measures of association and I'll see if I get anything obvious. Right? That was kind of, I had a question at the time about self versus other directed humor, right? Are you making fun of yourself or are you making fun of other people? Right? And I wanted to see if I could see trends related to that statistically. My data set was really small. I actually had too many variables, right? So that part of it didn't work out. The other part worked out really nicely. But anyway, so at this point, Andre and I got all the tweets together. He figured out how to get a much bigger data set than I had saved in my inbox. He developed a set of formal codes and I developed them with him. We also kept adding codes as we went. Talk more about this when we talk about textual analysis later. And then he coded the data and I checked up on him, right? And made sure that he and I were in agreement about all the codes. So this is our data set. Ta-da! This is in fact a subset of it. Kind of if you look at how the data is organized, you have here the stuff highlighted in green is the info we needed to identify the tweet. The popularity measures had to do with interactions on the tweets. And so those are that teal color. The blue is the list of themes that we identified. These are what's called dichotomous or dummy variables, which means you write 0 if it's present and 1 if it's not. What you have over here in the unhighlighted things, you have the kind of 0s and 1s. Essentially, I went through and designated some of these themes to be self-directed, meaning making fun of Muslim communities, and some of them to be other-directed, which is making fun of the state or non-Muslims or something like that. And then I added it up, and then I also had a binary version of that. So some of it was how many self-directed themes did you see versus how many other directed themes, and then it was, is this a self-directed or an other directed? Like I said, that part of the analysis, I think I actually had too many themes in the middle section. Like if I were redoing this project, I would have changed how I coded my data, but that wasn't something I could do at this particular moment. And I think also part of the reason I couldn't get a good result is because things I thought I saw on first glance didn't actually play out very well. Because I wasn't looking at the complete data set. I was looking at an unrepresentative sample. That's a thing that happens. So then after we have this data set of tweets, which contains the full text of the tweet, Twitter's great to work with because the whole thing is quite short, right? And then all this other mathematical information. So the first thing we did is we looked to see what themes were most common, looked to see what people interacted with, looked to see whether self or other directed led to interactions. And so we get kind of a couple of different approaches, right? So on the left here, we have the distribution of tweets by category. This is something that was fairly easy for me to generate in statistical software. And so you can see that 50% of just over 50% of the tweets involved dating, marriage, or courtship norms. 41% involved Islamic concepts. 25% norms of gendered behavior. 25% a play on a Western or American pickup line. Just under 22% sexual implications. Right. So, like I said, there were a lot of dirty jokes in these, and they were good. Right. You can kind of see how things were organized here. And then over here we have a kind of, these are screenshots from the text, where I talk about how things were retweeted, right? And earlier in the article, I have a whole lot of framework for talking through what is the author function of the retweet, which is a different thing, right? But I kind of go here that I'm like, look, here are some of the most common tweets, and note that they go on to reference questions about terrorism and surveillance, right? Let's go back to my place and yell at Fox News, right? Ends up being about kind of Islamophobia, right? And so kind of part of my analysis was the different things you can make fun of and how making fun of different things positions and constructs a common subjectivity, right? So this is what I was able to do with quantitative work. And then I turned to the qualitative stuff, right? Which was really about reading these tweets. And it was funny because I assumed Andre had some cultural knowledge and experience, but it actually turned out that he didn't have enough to really be able to get a lot of the jokes. Like he would come to me with some of them sometimes and be like, I have no idea why this is funny. And I would look at it and be like, oh, that's hilarious. And he's like, you need to explain this to me in like very small words, right? So, you know, this is quotes from the text, right? If the joke, I'll love you until you memorize Surah Al-Baqarah, is only funny if you know how long Surah Al-Baqarah is, right? Do you want to wake me up for Fajr is only funny, like it's only dirty, right? If you know that Fajr is conducted before dawn, so you'd have to spend the night with somebody, right? I don't know if this one works as well in Canada, but the prophet said to go all the way to China for knowledge. I'm only asking you to go to IHOP for love, right? IHOP is where Muslim youth hang out, or Dunkin' Donuts, right? Because you can, it's 24 hours, but no alcohol, right? So it's kind of like youth thing, right? So then you kind of get my analysis right here at the bottom. The Muslim marking of these tweets is the hashtag is accomplished through the explicit use of words, phrases, concepts, and experiences that connect tweeters to other Muslims. By marking the space in this way, the participants claim it as Muslim and express their unique experience of social life, including that of dating and romance. Paradoxically, after having marked that space as Muslim and authenticating it through their practices and membership, they also use the hashtag to criticize Muslim gender norms and dating culture, as well as American Islamophobia and policies towards Muslims in the USA and abroad. I would in fact cut out that paradoxically if I were rewriting this, because I think that makes perfect sense that once you've defined spaces in community, then you have debates about things affecting the community in it, or in fact, joke about it, right? Part of the argument elsewhere is like, joking makes community. That's part of why we tell jokes. So this is from the conclusion of the article, right? And kind of, this is where I move, like I and Andre, move beyond talking and thinking about just this one funny hashtag, right? Into thinking about how do digital spaces create community, provide opportunities for talking about identity and community, and all of this. So you can pause the video here if you want to read it more length, right? But the whole idea is that we wanted to find other ways that we could kind of use this information to think about what Muslim digital diasporas looked like. So there you've gotten the story of a complete article. This was a very easy project to do, unlike some of my projects, which are like never-ending monsters. This one had a very clear beginning, middle, and end that I probably couldn't have seen when I started writing it, but it ended up being a nice set just so story for you guys. So what I want to do for the rest of this is I want to give you guys a little bit of exploration of some key concepts. These come up in McGregor and they come up in Schwartz and Yanow, but I just kind of want to talk you through them, right? The first thing is the concept of validity, right? Which is really important when you're a positivist and matters in a different sense to non-positivists, right? So the big thing is, how do we know we're actually measuring what we think we're measuring, is how a positivist would say it, right? Because this idea of we want to like measure things about the world, but we want to make sure we're measuring them right. So you kind of have all sorts of stories where people are like, well, I can't figure out how to measure this thing that's completely ephemeral and like hard, you know, not something concrete that you can touch. So I'm going to find something that's a reasonable proxy for it, right? I can't actually quantify what the environment is like for LGBT people in the workplace. So instead I can quantify people's, like I can survey people and ask them how they feel, right? Which gets you their subjective impressions, which I think is a pretty good proxy for being for what actually happens. Or I can analyze, you know, reports of some kind, right? These are pretty good measures. Sometimes you end up with something completely whack because it's the thing you can measure. The classic example in political science is that a lot of us use this thing called polity scores to judge how democratic or authoritarian a country is. And like on the one hand, everybody uses them, so we all know we're talking about the same thing. On the other hand, the more you know about individual cases and the more you go into the details of polity scores, you're like, what the actual hell? Right? Like this does not actually matter. So there was a big kerfluffle after the January 6th attack on the Capitol when polity downgraded the US. below stable democracy for the first, they said for the first time in its history, and pretty much everybody who has ever studied the US before the civil rights movement was like, excuse me, are you telling me you coded it as a democracy in 1950? Because no, your own definition of democracy should not have held. Like, really, it was less democratic then than it is now, even if right now stability is a problem, right? We're still all using this stupid thing. Another great example is the Freedom House scores, which nobody likes except I guess the people who create them, or the failed state index, which also we're all like, oh, this is awful. Except if you need a number for state strength, the failed state index is great, right? You kind of see how this becomes a problem. So there are three kinds of validity, right? Face validity is, does this thing make any sense, right? If I told you I was going to study how LGBT friendly a company was based on how many women work there, you would laugh me out of the room, right? Like that does not actually tell me anything about queer people, right? If you were to tell me by how many people working there are comfortable identifying as being LGBT, okay, that's got more face validity, right? But there are all sorts of other conceptual problems with it, right? Content validity, does it match the concept you're trying to understand, right? This would be the issue with things like Freedom House or the Polity Index or the failed state index, meaning, are you actually certain that the way they've converted information into numbers makes sense? And then construct validity is, okay, if we would expect this thing to behave in a certain way, does it behave that way, right? So this might be the moment where people were like, wait, you thought the US was a democracy before 1950? Because that's got major errors based on what we know, right? So all of this is to say that kind of different forms of validity, this is a positivist way. The reason it's positivist, right, is because it assumes that there's a reality and what we're constructing is a picture of it. And we want the picture to come as close to matching the reality and be as accurate to the reality as possible. That assumes that we all see the same picture. It assumes that the thing out there in the world we're trying to measure is always going to be the same, right? It assumes this objective reality, which is the thing that both realists and interpretivists have trouble with, right? Interpretivists, because they're not convinced there is such a thing as objective reality. Realists, because they're not convinced that you can actually measure objective reality, right? That everyone's going to get the same picture of it, right? I mean, interpretivists don't think that either, right? But they think it slightly differently because they also object to the first principles, right? So you can see how that's slightly different. Hi, you coming? I'm going to bother you and see if you run away. Okay, so this is validity. The next is reliability, right? Which again, this is really positivist because they want to know, is this data collection method always going to get the same results? And anybody who's epistemologically positivist or interpretivist is going to be like, no, because that's not possible, right? Like, you know, somebody else, goes and like reconducts my research on, you know, anything I've ever done, right? They're not going to see the same things as me, right? So if you talk about intercoder reliability, right, this is a notion that's very positivist, which is to say that if two people look at the same piece of data, your rules should be such that they would give it the same information, right? You know, or that you want your questions on a survey to be specific enough that two people who actually have the same underlying reality give the same answer. Like, that's actually really hard to do. And positivists work really hard on this, trying to come up with objective rules and things like that. So you'll often see in work that's been coded by multiple people, you'll see that they work towards intercoder reliability. They double check. Do the different coders agree when they code the same thing, right? I worked in a psych clinic for a semester as an undergraduate, and one of my jobs was coding data, and all their data was double coded. Right. So essentially I got a survey response, and then I got a place where I had to enter the data, and I entered that data and then somebody else did it. This was in the early 2000s. So I in fact was entering it on paper. Right. Which I don't know why I was entering it on paper. Like it was 2000, 2001. the internet existed, computers existed. Maybe they then converted it to Scantron or something, I don't know. But then the point was the two coders were then compared. And if there were any instances where we hadn't transcribed the data the same way, they went and double checked, right? Because it really mattered that this data was correct in that way, but that was objective data, right? Replicatability, right? Could you do the same thing if you did the same thing again, right? I'm not convinced somebody else who read all those tweets would come up with exactly the same responses or analysis I would. They wouldn't come up with the same codes. They might not code them the same way. I might not code them the same way if I was coding them today. That is not how knowledge works, says the non-positivist, right? One kind of way to think about this that's more positivist friendly, right, is the concept of, does this like relate to prior concepts? Would people who've written other things about this understand what you're talking about? Or would the people involved understand what you're talking about, right? Would they see the connection between the concepts you're using and the actual material you're discussing? That is the sort of thing that falls into the interpretivist position, which is about reflexivity. And also, we'll get to it in a second, about uncertainty, right? Sorry, I can't actually see the top of my page, right? So positionality, right? How does where I'm placed limit my data or facilitate access to my data? How do the choices I make shape my data, right? Because interpretivists are less interested in kind of like validity and reliability in the same senses, they talk about kind of how was my data shaped and created, right? Or similarly, like sense making, right? How do I know there isn't a better explanation, right? So I love this line from Schwartz and Yanow. How would you know if there was something else afoot in the situation that might be a better explanation of the puzzle you are seeking to explain? Ah, that's such a line, right? And one way to do this is through member checking, right? You go and ask the people in the data, do you recognize the story I'm telling here? And that's something that I do with a lot of my work. I have to read this. Does this seem right to you? And then people tell me, no, you're wrong. Then I'm like, oh, that's really useful new information. And I can shift things. And sometimes people tell me I'm wrong and I'm like, I don't actually agree with you, but I'm going to lay out here why you think it's different than what I think, right? Again, because I think about relational accountability, right? That's something that's important to me. One thing is kind of, how do you describe this range of observed perspectives, right? And other things is like triangulation, right? Which is trying to get at the data, trying to get at the question from a couple of different angles. You don't just collect data one way, you collect it another way and you compare it, right? So here, just to give you an example, here's some text from my book. This is solid acronyms, which kind of makes it incomprehensible if you don't know my case. I've introduced all the acronyms before this point, right? But essentially what I'm trying to explain, and this is something reviewers asked me to include, and I was like, yeah, that's actually a good idea that I include it. There was an organization that I set out to study at the beginning of my study, and I couldn't get access to them, right? Just fundamentally, every time I went and talked to them, they like actively misheard what I was saying, told me things that didn't make any sense, said, that's really interesting, we'll get back to you, and then never got back to me, that sort of thing, right? And so at some point I stopped pushing, even though the comparison between them, the AFSC and the AAA, was central to my original argument that what I wanted to make. It's like, nope, I'm only going to have this data, so I'm leaving them alone. The second paragraph is like, okay, imagine what might be different if I had been acting in a different subject position, right? If I'd been able to get in with the AAA, with the AAFSC, what might I have known differently? And so I have some examples here, right? And I kind of leave it with, testing the frameworks and processes used to understand the data I was able to gather in the AIA is a comparative exercise that I leave for other researchers to explore more fully than I was able to, which is, I'm not doing this. You can do it. Go have fun. Go with my blessing, right? But I'm not doing that for you. So you can see the way, I'm no Shapiro yet, but I try to bring some of that energy into my writing. So the kind of last point I wanted to talk about is uncertainty, which is to say that interpretivists or positivists and non-positivists think about uncertainty differently. But both of us agree that we're never 100% certain of our knowledge, right? It's not actually possible. That this is an epistemological point on which we agree. And that the way we talk about our uncertainty should give our readers confidence that we are not overstating what we know, right? And so here you have, the quote from Schwartz and Yanow that you guys read, and the quote from KKV is from a section you didn't read, but all good scientists, social scientists, whether in the quantitative or qualitative traditions, report estimates of the uncertainty of their inferences, or it is appropriate to be bold in drawing causal inferences as long as we are cautious in detailing the uncertainty of the inference, right? So if you want to make an argument that you've just discovered a theory of everything, be very clear that you are uncertain of that inference, right? But that's your claim, right? So you might see me as doing this a little in the article on Muslim Candy Heart Rejects, where I basically said, okay, I think humor and hashtags create publics in digital spaces. And I think if we look for ways that people form discursive networks in digital spaces, we will be able to figure out something about how people make community and conceptualize identity, right? That's actually a pretty big argument, but that's full of all sorts of may, might, could apply, right? Like, no, I'm not. I mean, I'm a little bit confident of that, right? And some of that is not just based on this, but also based on the fact that I'm, a person who spends all of her time on the internet. I was before this whole thing happened. But so kind of that texture, right, changes the dynamic, right? But I'm uncertain, right? I'm reflexive about it. I'm open to admitting that other people might read this and think it's crap, right? Transparency makes it possible for you to judge my trustworthiness, right? Being cautious about my uncertainties allows me to be bold in making these claims. And so this is kind of fundamental as you guys move into the part of the semester where you're going to be going through academic articles and trying to understand how people framed their arguments. And in particular, when you're going to be designing your own projects, right? Because that's what you're going to be doing when we get back from break, is you're going to be designing a project from scratch. What you're going to be doing is trying to figure out where are the places where uncertainty is. Right? Uncertainty really comes in at the write-up stage, but you need to be aware of some of these issues as they proceed. So I'm gonna finish my presentation and stop sharing. So I hope any of this was interesting. I hope I didn't just talk everybody's ear off for too long. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you in class. Thanks a lot.